Throughout this series, we've explored the nature of resistance, its historical manifestations, its neurological bases, strategies to overcome it, and what exists beyond it. But there is something deeply powerful about seeing these principles applied in real stories, from people who faced and conquered the same force that you face now. Today, we'll dive into the journeys of individuals who transformed their relationship with resistance and, in doing so, achieved extraordinary accomplishments. They aren't superhumans with special abilities. They are people like you and me who developed a sophisticated understanding of this universal adversary. These stories aren't just inspiring. They're detailed maps of territories that you can traverse too. In each case, I'll highlight not just what was achieved, but the specific patterns of resistance faced and the exact strategies used to overcome them. The writer's block, J.K. Rowling and persistence through adversity. Few know that before Harry Potter became a global phenomenon, J.K. Rowling faced one of the most intense manifestations of resistance imaginable. As she herself described, "I was the biggest failure I knew." Recently divorced, a single mother living on government assistance and battling clinical depression, Rowling faced not just internal resistance but brutally challenging external circumstances. Resistance manifested for Rowling in multiple forms: fear of failure, devastating self-criticism, constant doubt about the value of her story, and the inner voice questioning whether she was wasting her time when she should be building a serious career. Rowling's pattern of overcoming is particularly instructive. She applied what we called in the previous episode the irreducible minimum technique. Unable to work for long periods due to the demands of being a single mother, she developed her manuscript in cafes during the brief moments when her daughter slept. 15 minutes here, half an hour there. She took advantage of any available fragment of time, refusing to wait for ideal conditions that would never come. When she couldn't afford to photocopy the entire manuscript to send to publishers, she typed each chapter again. What makes Rowling's story so powerful isn't just her eventual success, but her intuitive understanding that resistance feeds on grand ambitions. She never thought about writing a series of 7 books that would revolutionize children's literature. She thought only about finishing the next paragraph, the next chapter. As she later revealed, "I just had to keep putting one foot in front of the other." This is the essence of the strategy against resistance: reducing the immense to the manageable and moving forward consistently, regardless of the scale of progress. And finally, Rowling demonstrated what I've called existential confidence. Not because she never doubted, she doubted constantly, but because she continued moving forward despite the doubt. Harry Potter was rejected by 12 publishers before being accepted by Bloomsbury, whose first printing was just 1,000 copies. The message of her journey is clear. Resistance can be faced even in the most adverse circumstances, not by eliminating it, but by persisting despite it. The persistent entrepreneur, Sara Blakely, and transforming rejection into fuel. Sara Blakely, founder of Spanx and one of the most successful women in the business world, offers a fascinating study on how to transform the very nature of resistance to your advantage. Before creating her billion-dollar empire, Blakely faced a particular form of resistance: the paralyzing fear of rejection that prevents so many potential entrepreneurs from even starting. What makes her case so instructive is how she deliberately reconditioned her neural response to rejection from a young age. Her father frequently asked her, "What did you do to fail this week?" He wasn't encouraging failure. He was normalizing it as a necessary part of growth, desensitizing her nervous system to the discomfort of rejection. This practice aligns perfectly with what we discussed about neuroplasticity and reprogramming resistance circuits. When Blakely began developing the Spanx prototype, she faced rejection after rejection. All the manufacturers she contacted, all men, refused to produce her product, unable to comprehend her vision. Instead of interpreting these rejections as signs to give up, as resistance encourages us to do, she saw them as indicators that she was on the right track. If your idea hasn't been ridiculed at the beginning, it's probably not disruptive enough, she says, perfectly exemplifying what we call the inverted compass, using resistance as a guide to what is truly important. Blakely applied another crucial strategy against resistance. She kept her job as a fax machine salesperson while developing Spanx in her spare time, for 2 whole years. This contradicts the entrepreneurial myth of all or nothing, and illustrates the reduced risk approach that circumvents one of the amygdala's biggest activators. the fear of financial ruin. Perhaps the most notable aspect of Blakely's approach is her practice of premature disclosure. She deliberately talked about her ideas before they were fully formed, creating social accountability and public commitment, thus neutralizing the tendency for procrastination related to perfectionism. Today, Blakely claims that her greatest competitive advantage wasn't a brilliant idea or special funding, but her relationship with failure and rejection, the primary manifestors of resistance in entrepreneurship, the resilient athlete, Michael Jordan, and the alchemy of failure. In popular culture, Michael Jordan is often presented as the supreme example of excellence and success. What this narrative usually omits is that Jordan might be better understood as a case study on how to transform resistance into fuel for greatness. "I have failed repeatedly in my life, and that is why I succeed," says Jordan, articulating a deep understanding of the relationship between resistance and growth. Jordan's lesser-known story is that of his exclusion from his high school basketball team, a moment when resistance appeared in the form of devastating doubt. Instead of allowing this failure to confirm his limitations, as resistance would suggest, he transformed it into a daily ritual of overcoming. Jordan began training every day at 6 a.m. before school. This wasn't a temporary emotional response to failure, but the deliberate construction of a ritual, the third strategy we discussed in the episode about techniques against resistance. Throughout his career, Jordan developed what we can call a meta-strategy to transform resistance. He consciously created adversaries and obstacles, even when they didn't naturally exist. Famously, he invented insults from opponents to fuel his determination. This seemingly strange practice reveals a sophisticated understanding of resistance. Instead of trying to eliminate it, impossible, or just tolerate it, difficult, Jordan redirected it, transforming it from an internal obstacle into motivational fuel. During his peak years, Jordan exemplified another technique we discussed, the ability to create with fear, not in the absence of it. He admitted feeling intense nervousness before crucial games, but developed a relationship with this sensation that transformed it into hyperfocus instead of paralysis. Being Michael Jordan meant facing new challenges every day, he said, revealing his understanding that resistance never completely disappears, even at the height of success. It just changes form and requires continuous adaptation. Coach Phil Jackson, who worked extensively with Jordan, observed something revealing. Michael never confused motion with achievement. This distinction is crucial to understanding the sophisticated overcoming of resistance. It's not just about activity, which can be disguised procrastination, but about deliberate action aligned with real growth. The persistent scientist, Marie Curie, and overcoming imposed limits. The most pernicious forms of resistance aren't just internal, but reinforced by external social and cultural barriers. No one better exemplifies overcoming this combined resistance than Marie Curie, whose story reveals strategies applicable to anyone facing seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Born in Russian-occupied Poland, where women were forbidden from attending universities, Curie faced a version of resistance amplified by concrete external obstacles. She could easily have interpreted these barriers as signs that her goals were impossible, precisely what internal resistance whispers to us. Instead, she applied what we can call a detour strategy. When the direct path is blocked, find alternative routes. Curie participated in a clandestine flying university, studying in basements and apartments that constantly changed location to avoid detection by Russian authorities. Later, when she moved to Paris and entered the Sorbonne as one of the few female students, she faced another classic manifestation of resistance, the feeling of inadequacy and imposter syndrome. Living in poverty, often fainting from hunger during classes, she continued advancing through what can only be described as the power of rituals, studying at fixed times, regardless of her physical or emotional state. The work that eventually led Curie to become the first person to win 2 Nobel Prizes in different scientific fields exemplifies another crucial strategy against resistance: total immersion. When she and her husband first isolated the element radium, they worked in an unheated shed, manually moving tons of ore, a process that took 4 years of meticulous work. "I never saw Marie Curie allow herself to be distracted from the immediate task, no matter how arduous," observed a colleague. This capacity for sustained concentration is the antidote to resistance's tendency to divert us through distractions. Perhaps the most profound lesson from Curie's journey is how she handled the devastating loss of her husband and collaborator, Pierre. At the height of her grief, a condition that drastically amplifies resistance, she took over his teaching position, becoming the first female professor at the Sorbonne. "I must continue alone," she wrote in her diary, exemplifying a quality that few discuss when talking about overcoming resistance: the ability to continue even when motivation is completely absent, when only commitment remains. Personal transformation, Oprah Winfrey and the alchemy of trauma. When we talk about overcoming resistance, we often focus on external achievements. Oprah Winfrey's journey reminds us that some of the most significant battles against resistance occur in the realm of personal transformation and healing. Born into rural poverty and a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, Winfrey faced not just the common resistance we all experience, but its most intensified version: the deep psychological trauma that creates neural patterns practically designed to prevent growth and vulnerability. What makes her journey so instructive is how she consciously applied many of the strategies we discussed. First, the inverted compass. Winfrey developed a practice of deliberately moving in the direction of her greatest discomfort, recognizing that growth was precisely where resistance was strongest. "Do one thing that scares you every day," she frequently advises, distilling this strategy into an applicable daily practice. Second, the irreducible minimum. Instead of trying to completely transform her psychology at once, impossible, she adopted small daily practices of self-examination and reflection. Her well-known habit of keeping a gratitude journal exemplifies this approach, a practice simple enough to be sustainable, but powerful enough to gradually reconfigure neural patterns. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Winfrey masterfully demonstrates the strategy of strategic self-compassion that we discussed. "For years I blamed myself for the abuse," she revealed. "Understanding that it wasn't my fault was the defining moment in my healing." This isn't an emotional platitude. It's a sophisticated neurological intervention that interrupts the self-amplifying circuits of shame that trauma creates and resistance exploits. The most revealing aspect of Winfrey's approach is how she transformed her vulnerability from perceived weakness into her greatest strength, using her own painful experiences as a bridge for authentic connection with others. This is a perfect example of what we call the capacity to serve that exists beyond resistance. "What I know for sure is that using your wound to help others heal theirs is one of the most powerful ways to transcend suffering," she says, articulating precisely the transformation that occurs when resistance is not just overcome, but integrated as a teacher. Common patterns. What we can learn from these stories. What unites these seemingly different stories? What patterns emerge that we can apply in our own battles with resistance? First, all these individuals demonstrate the fundamental principle that I explored at the beginning of this series. They didn't eliminate resistance. They learned to move forward despite it. None of them waited to feel ready or confident before acting. They exemplify the strategy of action preceding motivation. Second, they all transformed failure and rejection from paralyzing threats into useful data, reinterpreting these experiences not as confirmations of inadequacy, as resistance would suggest, but as necessary indicators of growth. Third, each developed some form of ritual or consistent practice that removed the decision points where resistance typically attacks. As we discussed in the episode on strategies, resistance thrives when each action requires a new decision. Fourth, all demonstrated the gradual transformation of fear from enemy to teacher, not by trying to eliminate it, but by developing a different relationship with it. This is the essence of what we discussed as coexistence with fear that exists beyond resistance. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, each of these individuals illustrates the great reversal I mentioned in the last episode. They came to see resistance not just as an obstacle, but as a necessary portal for their evolution. As Blakely observed, "All the greatest rewards in my life have come from the other side of fear and discomfort, not from trying to avoid them." Applying these lessons in your own life, the true value of these stories isn't in distant admiration, but in extracting principles applicable to your own journey. How can you implement the lessons from these narratives? Start by identifying your personal version of resistance. Does it manifest primarily as paralyzing doubt as for Rowling, as fear of rejection as for Blakely, as response to failure as for Jordan, as an apparently insurmountable barrier as for Curie, or as patterns of self-criticism based on past experiences as for Winfrey? Resistance is universal in its existence but highly individualized in its expression. Identifying your specific pattern is the first step to transcending it. Second, choose a strategy from one of these stories that especially resonates with you and implement it today on a micro scale. If it's Winfrey's inverted compass, identify a small action that provokes discomfort and deliberately move in that direction. If it's Rowling's irreducible minimum, break your current project into parts so small that it would be ridiculous not to do them. Third, consider how you've been interpreting failures and obstacles. Have you allowed them to confirm the limiting narratives that resistance promotes, or are you willing to reinterpret them as Jordan and Blakely did, as indicators that you're on the right track? Finally, remember the most important pattern that emerges from these stories. Persistence isn't a mystical personality trait that some possess and others don't. It's a practice that anyone can develop through a sophisticated understanding of resistance and the consistent application of strategies to transcend it. Conclusion: your story of overcoming. I began this video by noting that these stories aren't just inspiring, they're maps for territories that you too can traverse. The truth is that each person watching this video is in the process of writing their own story of overcoming resistance. This story doesn't need to culminate in international fame like Rowling or Oprah. It might be about finally writing that book, launching that business, transforming that relationship, or healing that old wound. The scale is irrelevant. The process is identical. As Joseph Campbell observed in his analysis of the hero's journey, where you stumble, there lies your treasure. Resistance marks precisely these stumbling points, the places where your most significant growth and your most valuable contribution are waiting. Until then, I want to hear from you. Which of these stories resonated most with your own experience of resistance? Share your reflection in the comments. You never know when your story will become the map that someone else needs. If this content is helping you understand and overcome your own patterns of resistance, give it a like, share it with someone who could benefit from these perspectives, and subscribe to receive the next episode in this series. Resistance thrives in isolation. By building this community, we are creating a powerful collective antidote.